Hey everyone, this is David Pike, the Motorcity Mechanic. Today's video is part one of a four-part series on the shortcut procedure for the removal and replacement of the oil pump assembly on a Chrysler 3.2 and 3.6 liter front-wheel drive vehicle. Now in part one, we're going to start with discussing the differences between the by-the-book method and the shortcut version. Mainly the things we don't have to take off and also the things we don't have to worry about breaking during the removal. And also we're going to dive into the repair. We're going to get as far as actually removing the chain and the gear from the pump. So with that, let's go ahead and talk about the differences. Now the shortcut procedure pretty much starts the same as what the by-the-book method was. We're dealing with that plastic cover that covers up the drive belt on the passenger side of the engine, mainly because it covers up a portion of that lower stamped steel pan. We're also going to be draining the oil, of course, and then we're going to take that lower stamped steel pan off. Now things that we're not going to be messing with are that structural member that goes from the radiator support to that cross member that has that rack and pinion, so we don't have to worry about any of the bolts seizing up there. Also, the exhaust manifold, that crossover pipe that had the broken bolts, we don't even have to touch that, so the broken bolts don't come into play. We're also not dealing with the upper aluminum pan, so that means we don't have to fight with the old dipstick tube. All we're doing is getting access to that lower stamped steel pan, draining the oil, and at that point we've got access to the pump and all the fasteners that we need to get to. Now, like I mentioned, that plastic shield that covers up that side of the oil pan needs to be taken off, and at that point we can actually start draining the oil. Now the drain plug is a 13 millimeter. Now the main thing you need to do is make sure you got a catch can up underneath, so when you go to take it loose, we don't have to worry about it spilling everywhere. So just back it off and make sure you don't lose it. Keep it to the side. Now once all of it has drained out, we'll go ahead and reinstall that drain plug. Also at that time, go ahead and tighten it down. And I'll remind you again at the end of the video just in case you didn't. So now that we've drained all the oil out of the engine, we can go ahead and work on separating the lower stamped steel oil pan from the upper aluminum oil pan. Now we've got a total of 15 10 millimeter bolts all the way around the perimeter. And we've got two 10 millimeter nuts. So we'll remove all the bolts and we'll back the nuts off but still keep them in place. So that way when we finally break the oil pan free from the upper aluminum section, it doesn't just fall. So that way the nuts will keep it in place till we're ready to take it off. So go ahead and start taking those 10 millimeter bolts off. So when you finally make it around to either one of those 10 millimeter nuts, just back it off, but yet keep it threaded on the stud. That should be more than enough. So now we'll just go ahead and repeat the process all the way around. So at this point we're ready to start separating that stamped steel pan from the upper aluminum section. And the way we're going to do it is we're going to be using two tools here. I've got a dead blow hammer and a putty knife. And we're actually going to be tapping on the putty knife in between the stamped steel pan and the aluminum section, and we're going to break the seal on that 3-bond adhesive. And we're going to work all the way around the perimeter until we finally get it freed up. Now when you're going through your toolbox and you're looking for which putty knife is going to work best, there's a couple things you need to take into consideration. The first one is, do you have a lot of room to work in? If you do, then the width isn't a big issue. But if you've got an AC compressor, possibly an engine mount, section of exhaust, something to that effect in the way, you might need to choose something a little more narrow. And the other thing is, we're hitting it with a hammer. So you want something with a solid metal core. If it's not solid and it's got a hollow plastic handle, there's a chance that when you're hitting it with the hammer, you might damage it. So pick your corner where you've got some room to work, get your putty knife ready, and start tapping on it with a hammer. Now you're going to have to work it all the way around the perimeter till it finally breaks loose. Now the one thing you don't want to do is to grab a flat tip screwdriver or a pry bar and start wedging it up under here and trying to bend it up. Because that RTV holds on very well. what you're going to end up doing is you're going to end up bending the lip of the pan, and then you're going to have issues with trying to get it flat, and then you're probably going to have some kind of oil leak afterwards. So just take your time and work all the way around the perimeter using the putty knife and a hammer. So after going all the way around with that putty knife, we've now got the seal broke loose. Now we've still got two 10mm nuts that are actually holding the pan to the block. Remember, we kept it there so when we broke the seal loose, we didn't have to worry about the pan falling. So we're going to go ahead and take those all the way off. And then what you need to do is, when you take the pan off, try to lift straight up. Try to keep it as level as possible, because even though we drained the oil out earlier, while we're working on it, some oil from the crankcase more than likely has made its way to the bottom of the pan again, so you don't want to make a big mess. So be prepared. Support this with your hand, because it's going to be overhead if you're working on the vehicle with the engine in it, not on a stand like this is. So go ahead and back off on the two 10mm nuts. Try not to lose them. Grab the pan. You might have to wiggle a little bit more just to break the rest of the seal loose, and try to come up straight. Now with the oil pan removed, I can point out some key features related to the oil pump. And one of the main things that jumps out is the pickup tube and strainer. Now this is removable, and it bolts to the back of the oil pump, and it has an O-ring that seals it. Now typically you only need to replace this if you've got some sort of catastrophic engine failure, or if you've got large amounts of metal or debris floating around. At that point, this does need to be replaced. Otherwise, being that we're dealing with a check engine light, a code, and a circuit issue related to the solenoid on the pump, we're going to be reusing this. But we're also going to have to replace that O-ring, and I'm going to show you a little bit more about that once we get this off. Now at the front of the pump, there is a metal plate here that's attached with two 8mm bolts, here and here. That plate covers up the chain, the gear, the bolt that attaches the gear to the pump, and also access to the tensioner for the chain. Now depending on where you purchased the pump from, you may or may not have threaded holes here and here, because the latest version from Mopar does not require the plate to be attached. So of course there's no need for threaded holes at that point. So you may or may not have threaded holes. If you do, reinstall the cover. If you don't, the cover is no longer needed. If you follow that strainer and pickup tube to where it bolts to the block, and you move over to the side right here, you'll see that there's a solenoid. That is the electrical portion of the oil pump. There is wiring that's attached to that comes out the side of the block. We'll be dealing with that as we're taking the pump off, but we're going to leave the solenoid attached to the body of the pump. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and remove the old pickup tube and strainer. Like I said before, there's a 10mm bolt on the back we're going to access. What I do recommend using is a ratcheting wrench if you've got one. A typical box end wrench will work fine. The ratcheting actually saves you a lot of time. Once you get it broke loose, you don't have to take it back off and reposition. You can just keep going with it. Now you'll get to a point where you don't need to wrench anymore. It's loose enough, you can get it off by hand. And once you get the bolt off, set it somewhere where you won't lose it. And now all we got to do on the pickup tube is just rotate it to break it loose, and then kind of walk it off. And there you have it. So now we can move over to the two 8mm bolts that hold that cover on. Now we got access to the gear, the chain, the tensioner, and the bolt. Now the type of fastener on the front of that pump is going to be a Torx, and it's going to be a T45 Torx to be exact. That's what we're going to be using to back that bolt off. And one thing I want to point out is the orientation of the gear. Now there is no correct way or wrong way, but what I've seen is on some oil pumps when I take the cover off, the gear side with the recessed groove is facing outward, and on others, the flat side of the gear is facing outward. So my recommendation to you is, as you're taking it off, kind of make note of which way it is and reinstall it in the way you took it off. In this case, we've got the recessed groove facing outward. That's the way you're going to reinstall it. But yours may be different on your vehicle. Now with that upper oil pan assembly still in place, we've got a little bit of clearance issue. We can still work with it, but when you go with your T45 and you ratchet, you're going to find out that the clearance is kind of tight, and also it may be at a slight angle. But even at a slight angle, we're still able to break it loose. Other options you have are to use a shallower bit or just the bit itself without a drive on the end. Possibly grab your wrench too, put it on there, and break it loose that way. So for now, what we're going to do is go ahead and back it all the way off. Now the tensioner for the timing chain is actually spring loaded. There's nothing hydraulic about this one whatsoever. So all we got to do is actually move the arm over to get the slack on the chain so we can slide the gear off. I want to show you how you can actually use a screwdriver in this location right here. Do a little bit of prying and you'll actually get movement out of the arm. So what I do is I get my screwdriver and I insert it into that pocket on the side of that tensioner arm. And all I do is move it against the oil pan, and now I've got all kinds of slack in the chain. Now if you look at the front of the gear, you can see there are a lot of holes around the face of it. Now what I like to do is get some bent needle nose pliers, and I grab the ends and I insert them into a couple of the adjoining holes. This way I can actually grab onto the gear, because one hand is going to be used for taking the gear and the chain off, the other is moving the tensioner. So we grab the screwdriver like we showed before, get down in here, bend the chain tensioner out of the way, grab the gear and start wiggling it off. So now that we've got it completely off, we can release the tension. We can come down here and work the gear off the chain. And there you have the gear. So up to this point, you got to see the big differences between the by the book method and the shortcut method. Now in part 2, what we're going to do is we're going to dive more into it. We're going to be dealing with the electrical portion of the pump as far as how to get all that loose. We're going to be talking about the special socket that actually makes this shortcut possible. And we're going to go ahead and remove the oil pump and begin to go back with its replacement. So make sure to check it out. So if you like this video, please make sure to give it a big thumbs up on YouTube. Don't forget you can find me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And if you get any comments or suggestions about anything you saw in this part of the series, please make sure to email me at david@motorcitymechanic.com. If you like to shop on Amazon, please feel free to use the link that's in the description. Any purchases that you make will help support this channel. Once again, everybody, thanks for watching and stay tuned for part 2.